Now we're going to learn about a very important topic called elasticity. Elasticity looks at the responsiveness of one variable to another. And so what we're going to look at first is the price elasticity of demand. Now this looks at how much the quantity demanded changes when there's a change in the price of that good. We know the law of demand gives us a downward sloping demand curve. So if we look at the price and the quantity and the relationship between the two, we know that it's a negative relationship. But the price elasticity of demand talks about a quantitative measure of how much there is a change in the quantity demanded when there's a change in the price level. So when we look at the price elasticity of demand, the way we're going to calculate it is we'll take the percentage change in the quantity demanded and divide it by the percentage change in price. So if we look at 2 points on a demand curve, we can look at what the change in the price is between these 2 points and the change in the quantity between these 2 points. And the percentage change in the price and the percentage change in the quantity are the two numbers that go into the elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of demand equation. Then we're going to take absolute value of it to get the measure of price elasticity. Now let's see what we do with that. In this table we can see a couple of examples of how to calculate and compute the percentage change in price elasticities. So suppose we had the data that our initial point on a demand curve had a price of 20 and a quantity of 100. And the new point, the one we've moved to, has a price of 22 and a quantity of 80. To calculate the percentage changes, we can look at the percentage change of price. It's 10%. The change in price is $2. The initial price was 20. So $2 divided by 20 times 100 gives us 10%. The percentage change in quantity is the change of negative 20 divided by the initial quantity of 100 times 100, we get negative 20%. The price elasticity of demand, using the initial value method of calculating percentage changes, the price elasticity of demand is 2, which is the absolute value of negative 20 divided by 10% is 2. Another alternative way of calculating percentage changes is using the midpoint method. The midpoint method substitutes the average or the midpoint of the two prices for the initial price. So in the initial way, the way we looked at it before, the way we computed it using the initial value method, we had the initial price level and the initial quantity. If we use the midpoint, we put in the midpoint price and the midpoint quantity. We get a slightly different measure for elasticity. Now let's look at a demand curve and look at whether we have what we call an elastic or an inelastic demand curve. Here's our demand curve, and we can look at 2 different points. This point where the price is $6 and this point where the price is $5. And at this point, the quantity demanded is 12, and at this point, the quantity demanded is 20. So what's the elasticity, price elasticity of demand? Well, we look at the percent change in quantity and the percent change in price. So if we move from this point to this point, our percent change is a negative 40% change in the quantity demanded, and the price has gone up by 20%. So when we look at the price elasticity of demand, that is 2.0, which is greater than 1. And we call this an elastic demand curve because the percent change in quantity is greater than the percent change in price. You can think of it in a way of when something is elastic, it's very responsive or very flexible. And so when there's a relatively large change in quantity for a given change in price, we call that an elastic demand curve. Elastic means the price elasticity is greater than 1. For this demand curve, we have what's called an inelastic demand curve. When we calculate the price elasticity moving from this point to this point, we get a price elasticity of 0.5, which is less than 1. This is an inelastic demand. inelastic would be not very responsive or not very flexible. So we see a relatively small percentage change in quantity for a relatively larger percentage change in price. So our price elasticity comes out to be less than 1. For this demand curve, for this portion of the demand curve, and we're moving from this point to this point, our price elasticity turns out to be exactly equal to 1, and we call that a unit elastic demand. Another potential elasticity is perfectly inelastic demand. That's a vertical demand curve. When you think about it, perfectly inelastic would be non-responsive or non-flexible. So no matter what percentage change in price we have of this demand curve, we can see there's zero change in the quantity demanded. So the percent change in quantity demanded is 0, and the price elasticity is 0. So for a perfectly inelastic demand curve, the price elasticity is 0, and the quantity demanded is not responsive at all to changes in the pool. Perfectly elastic is the diametrically opposite of perfectly inelastic. A perfectly elastic demand curve is flat, and we can see any change in the price would lead to an infinite change in the quantity demanded. So perfectly elastic demand has a price elasticity of infinity. Well, here's some examples of elasticity, price elasticity for different goods and services. Here's an estimate of the price elasticity of salt of being 0.1. So we can see that that's a very inelastic demand for salt. So no matter what the change in price is, the demand for salt is not going to be very responsive. Go to the other side, we have air travel. The estimate for the price elasticity for air travel is 2.4. A change in the price of air travel is going to lead to a relatively large change in the quantity demanded for air travel. So you can look through these different goods and services and look at their price elasticities and try to think about why it is that specific brands of coffee have a very high responsiveness to changes in price, whereas weekend canoe trips have a very low price of elasticity of demand. And there are several things that determine the price elasticity of demand. One of those is the availability of substitutes. If there are many substitutes, the demand is going to be very elastic, because if the price of a good changes, you can just go to one of the substitutes. If there are a few substitutes, demand is going to be inelastic, because no matter what happens to the price, you're going to have to stay with the same good or service. As time goes on, the longer time that passes, the more elastic demand is going to be, because you can find more substitutes or you can change your behavior. The fraction of your budget. And if it's a large fraction of your budget, you're going to have a relatively elastic demand, because it's taking up so much of your budget, you're going to look for substitutes and alternative ways to demand. And if it's a necessity, if the product is a luxury, it's going to be relatively elastic. If the product is a necessity, it's going to be inelastic.